what I'm trying to curate in this sort of conceptual biology forum is kind of an openness to embracing concepts or ideas that kind of go beyond what is being presented, you know, from the fields of chemistry, physics, and genetics. You know, at the same time, you know, when you start to do that, people can sometimes kind of get worried that you're going to be stepping into things like vitalism or creationism, you know, or other sorts of things that sort of are dubbed as being anti or non-scientific. And so I think that's like an important line to try to walk, and also just have a dialogue about. I think that is not a dialogue where that I think is really had in a rigorous way, you know, in the mainstream experimental biological sciences. And so I think you two are, I think, like very well apt to potentially sort of have that sort of a dialogue in a way. And so I feel like Bernd, like with your, especially with like your work, like Properties of Life, I think you're really trying to come up with concepts of life that you think go beyond the kind of genetic, chemical, and physical way of thinking. Which isn't to say that you're not using and employing all of those ways of thinking. And then I think, Dan, I think you're a very rigorous philosopher who really cares about philosophy of life and philosophy for life. But you want to be really careful about how we talk about these concepts, so that we don't allow kind of a sloppiness to kind of slip in where we don't really get anywhere. Is that kind of a fair? Do you feel like that's a fair depiction of kind of where you both are? So what I thought would be helpful is, you know, if Dan, you could sort of like bring up some of these issues you sort of see potentially happening in terms of sort of a lack of rigor and a bit of a sloppiness. And so we could talk about those. And I think what may be happening in a lot of these cases is that people are using the same word, a word like agency, and could mean very different things. And the one thing that you have to know is in the world of experimental biology, people haven't even thought about that word really, right? So you have some experimentalists who want more, and now they're starting to see these terms, and they might look in the literature, and it's kind of confusing because depending on who you read, the way they sort of are using that word could mean very, very different things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good description of what I'm looking for, to really be sure about a rigorous scientific approach. But if you do that, you can put things together that really come up from a an phenomenological approach. If you really take the phenomena serious that come up from physiological and molecular studies, you find some properties, some principles that are not just concepts or just ideas or some ideologies or something like this, but they just come up from the phenomena themselves. I really call this phenomenology, and this doesn't comes away from scientific rigorous studies. It includes all what science has, all the science knowledge and all that what we have in molecular biology and physiology, but it's just taking the phenomena serious that come up from this. And so I think if we can go along these phenomena that come up from the new genetic work, for example, or from cell biology, seeing that everything is organized in a cell. And then we just have to take the consequences from these phenomena. And then we have some different approaches. So it's not so much about different ideas or new hypotheses, but it's just to take the phenomena serious that come out from all the knowledge we have in physiology. And in this sense, I think what I'm trying has some um, scientific rigor, to be sure not to trap to come into the trap of vitalism and things like this. And so I really want to focus on phenomenology, to really to take serious what the organism is answering in all these studies we have today.
Okay, so that's helpful to get kind of where you're coming from, Dan. I'm curious. Maybe if maybe you could start by just kind of giving like what's your approach. One thing I will say, I had a chance to go to the kind of the big meeting for philosophers, historians, sociologists of biology. You were there too in Porto, in Portugal, last year now. Uh, I wonder if that phenomenological notion was really represented there. And and I'll put that just sort of as an aside. But Dan, yeah, I wonder, do you totally resonate with that, or do you have a different kind of tack on how you see advance being made from your vantage point?
So I have a complementary approach, I think, because we share very distinct kinds of trainings and backgrounds. One of the things I'm most interested in is just focusing very upfront on how we talk with each other across the aisle. So when biologists come to philosophy meetings or when, philosophers go to biology meetings, there is there is kind of a massive gap in what we can sort of assume that the other person is going to be brought up to speed on. So when we jump into questions like rigor and conceptual sloppiness or something like that, then these are the first thing that I try to do is try to impress that it matters how we it matters how we communicate with each other. The words that we use matter. And
Hmm.
since the words that we use matter, this puts up the opportunity to kind of reflect on what precisely the type of work we want to do entails.
Hmm.
Because ultimately, conceptual biology is very um, interested in the use of concepts, which, among other things, are expressed in terms of words. And so, for instance, one of the things that struck me was, to be rigorous and to avoid sloppiness, there are certain ways that we can kind of tease apart a couple of words that are not quite synonymous with it, but could be re-articulations of those ideas. So, for instance, I don't think that, for instance, clarity, some forms of clarity, which is a form of rigor, should get in the way of new interpretations of concepts that can be revised in light of new evidence, in light of new ideas, right? And to put it kind of provocatively, I think that there's a role for something like ambiguity in the way that
Hmm.
we use concepts. Um, Not to say that we should not rigorously define our concepts and stuff like that, but as if we buy into certain types of rigor and clarity, and we shut off the ability to revise our concepts and to interpret them in light of new things because we've defined them in an ultimate way, then this kind of shuts down the avenues for shared communication, I think. So
Okay.
it's
Okay.
it's kind of we're kind of coming at it from completely different uh,
Mhm.
perspectives, I think.
Okay. So yeah, you think there's a difference in your approaches.
Oh, sure, but this is based on contingency of our training and
Oh yeah, no,
histories
it's not a,
and
it's not a. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. I'm just trying to make that clear. Okay, so that's fair. Maybe we could start with, my understanding, Dan, is you have a bit of hesitancy about the use of this word agency,
Mhm.
um, that's been coming up. I think, uh, for instance, I know someone like Philip Ball, who recently wrote how life works, has been trying to use that concept, like how you're saying, as a way to kind of just open up the discussion in mainstream science to kind of go beyond uh, mm, kind of a physical chemical reductionism, basically. Um, so yeah, I'm just wondering if you could kind of highlight your 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 how you feel about the use of that word. And Bernd, I know in your book you've used that word as one of the central principles, agency and also autonomy, which I believe you think are different. But Danny, I'm just wondering if you could maybe comment on that.
Okay, well, I'll introduce my thoughts in terms of a metaphor. Speaking of ambiguity, so maybe some of the young people watching this would get this reference, but there's this sci-fi movie called The Predator, um, where there's this alien that is unable to see in the same way that we do, and it requires this mask to kind of filter out different types of electromagnetic radiation. It's usually keyed into like heat, for instance, but in one scene, the people hunting the predator are not able to see it, and so it has to kind of shift through the different modes of vision, so to speak, to kind of like piece out or to parse out any kind of gestalt that it can use to triangulate, the things that are hunting it. And that's kind of a long-winded metaphor for how I think about agency and concepts in general, not just in terms of, this being a threat or this being a great idea or something like that, but rather, we can think about a term in terms of its fruitfulness, in terms of its ability to capture uh, 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 phenomena, for instance. We can evaluate these things on the basis of their ontological sort of like, what is this saying about the nature of the world? We can say this about like how this is helping our knowledge, produce knowledge and to understand things better. And finally, and this is where the root of my hesitancy, I also see a kind of rhetorical dimension to concepts. And the hesitancy that I have with agency, I think, comes from that sort of corner of the concept is the rhetorical potential to be misused.
Can you be a bit more specific about that? The rhetorical, yeah. Where do you see that being a problem?
Well, um, agency is something that means so many different things to so many different people that there is a large component of the sort of space that these meanings occupy within the term agency, where, for instance, there is a kind of connotation for cognition to be emphasized. To be an agent, for instance, is the ability to make a decision. To make a decision, you would have to deliberate. To deliberate, you need to possess rationality, etc. And these are all forms of cognition. And of course, biologists use metaphorical language all the time, like a cell remembering something that happened to it and then recalling it, or the immune system,
Hmm.
having a memory or something like that. But if depending on how seriously you take this language, there are, I think, bad faith actors out there who want to zero in on scientists using this language, perhaps out of context, and drawing unwarranted conclusions about what they're trying to say about the nature of life, for instance.
Okay.
Yeah,
So, okay, yeah, Bernd, yeah, I'm
yeah,
curious how you
but
respond to that.
that's the essential point to get clear what a biologist really can understand by agency, and that's why I always try to reduce the term agency to a very basic understanding and to get rid of all the connotations that can come with agency, but really to understand agency in the first line as nothing else than activity, agency in the sense of activity and nothing else. So I really think that every organism that is living has some form of self-activity, um, an agency as a basic form, a very general form. And then you can describe, or I tried this in a paper to describe that there may be other levels of agency that that can be identified as well, that may include in organisms some forms of teleology, of some directionality, and all these things. But to have a good first idea of agency, I think it's really important to come down to a very proper and very straightforward definition of the activity itself. And that's the important point of talking about agency. I know that many people in biology and philosophy at once think about the agent human that who can plan in the future, who can see, can have goals and things like this. A basic form of an organism, let's take a bacterium, doesn't have these goals or these perspectives that we can have. And so I think we have to be a little bit reductionistic in this case. So reductionism can be very helpful, and to reduce all these things to this basic form of activity and try to understand what an organism is doing already in its metabolism, in reading out its genome, organizing its DNA, and all these things. All these very basic functions are, in my view, this basic principle of agency. And if we can get down all this discussion and get rid of these connotations that come up with by philosophers or other people, and really to make this reduction to activity, I think we really have a very basic principle, a very general understanding of what really is going on in a simple cell or in very basic organisms like bacteria. And if we can get clear about this basic form of agency, I think we have a different starting point for discussions.
Do you just, so it felt like your characterization of agency rested on the use of the word activity.
Activity.
So activity.
Activity is central on this, yeah.
So would you say that this type of activity is really native to living systems and not non-living ones? Or would you say that
I
physical
think so.
systems also have, I guess I want to understand a bit better, but what you mean by the word activity and how activity in a living system is different than a hurricane physically self-organizing, for example.
It will be hard to draw a very clear line to some physical principles, and I'm not so much interested in clear difference between living and non-living, but every living organism has itself some form of this basic activity. There's no organism that doesn't have this activity. Perhaps you can compare it with some chemical processes or even some physical processes. I don't know, but basically I don't care about this.
Okay.
The thing is that an organism always has this activity, and that's the phenomenon. Or perhaps it's even better to talk about self-activity, because it comes out of a self, an entity, some entity that is living like a cell. So self-activity is perhaps even the better term. And I think that agency really expresses this principle of self-activity. And wherever you look into the physiology of a cell, to generate the membrane, to read out the DNA and to construct a messenger RNA, and to build proteins, and all these things that are mitochondria. They are always traveling through the whole cell. They are not just in one place. Most pictures we use in student courses propose that they are entities at these places and we know where they are. But if you have videos from processes in the cell, there is always movement and change, and mitochondria fuse and go apart. And all these processes are constantly going on in a cell, but only describing these very, very basic and general activities, this self-activity, this I think is really that can be described as agency or self-activity. That's what I mean, nothing else. If we look then in more complex organisms, we have to study what comes in addition to it. But if we don't have this very, very basic notion of self-activity, agency, we always will get into all these discussions about what really do we mean with agency. And there are a lot of differences when we have these different notions. And I think all this discussion about agency needs to come down to this basic phenomenon. That's a very important point.
Dan, I'm curious, what
we discussed about this
no, but
when
I'm just
Dan
curious.
visited me here in the institute. We had a really good discussion about this.
So
We did.
what do you, does that satisfy you, or is there still a concern for you?
So I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied, but the worry lingers in the background. So that's good because the worry is no longer up front. It's kind of it's been pushed to the background. I'm open to the possibility that this might be just a verbal issue from my side, because the idea of self-activity, and actually when Bernd and I were talking, the German eigen-activity
Yeah.
is even better, I think, than self-activity because it has this kind of root in a form of selfhood that doesn't imply a conscious self in terms of the identity of a person or something like that. But rather like it's this possessing of a well, it's kind of like it's difficult to translate.
Yeah.
But I was perfectly happy with the term eigen-activity.
Yeah, that was a good point in our discussion. Yeah.
And
exactly.
Do you think there's a people within the philosophy of science who've kind of worked out that notion of agency?
They have, and they've also done more. I mean, I should say up front, I'm not a specialist in agency, because this is a very, very rich field. So most of the field in most of the discussion of agency has been populated in just about every different possible way that you can interpret the word. You have people, for instance, grasping back to old romanticist conceptions of biology, like at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, people like Goethe and Herder and stuff like that, who seem to be grasping towards something that we consider to be agency or some form of teleology, for instance. And then you have other people who are just very interested in this notion, not of these sort of historical romanticist connotations, but rather something along the lines of what Bernd was just talking about, like this sort of degrees of freedom in activity that an organism has in contradistinction to its environment. It's not just a passive receiver of what to do, but rather there is this kind of active navigation, active sort of negotiation of things happening in the environment.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, what is interesting, and this is what really struck me, when I went to this philosophy and history of science conference, which is that there's so much rich thinking being done, and it is not at all penetrating the minds of practicing biologists, right? So I think that's just something, and maybe this goes back to, Dan, what you're saying about how we talk to each other, right? I wonder what the point of all of that work is. if the people who are actually doing experiments in labs, you for instance, you are an expert on the concept of agency relative to most people, who are dictating the flow of where money goes for scientific research. So it just, it's, I'm not saying that that's not a solution, but I think that's just something to be pointed out. So, the other thing is, Dan, it seems like you were talking about kind of that term being co-opted by people with a different agenda, and sort of there being like a bit of, and so this sort of rhetorical issue, right? So Are you saying like folks, people who sort of take a more creationist view of things, or are there any particular?
Individuals?
Oh, no,
No,
no, no.
I
You don't have to name individuals. I'm just talking about sort of impulses. Is that what you're referring to? I'm just trying to make. I just want to be. I just want to make sure I'm clear on on what streams of impulses that you're worried about, kind of co-opting and taking out of context, kind of the use of the word
right.
agency.
So agency, for instance, is playing a big role in um, this idea of the extended evolutionary synthesis, which has spent a long time, and a lot of people are interested in kind of. I'm just very, clunkily summarizing this discussion, but there's a sort of a dissatisfaction with the modern synthesis as having left out a couple of things from biology, from the nature of life, from evolution and development, or including development, for instance. And agency tends to come up in those discussions as something that is required for making sense of something like maybe niche construction or something like that. Um, but these poor faith actors will take out a specific sort of broad claim about agency that it's fundamental, which in philosopher circle, fundamental is kind of an F word, because you have to be able to interrogate and look behind every single concept, so to speak. But if agency is taken as fundamental, so to speak, then and you tack onto it something like every single living being uh, possesses agency, and this is a reason to be skeptical of the modern synthesis, then all of a sudden you have all the material that you need for a creationist to sort of pluck that out of context and say, see, biologists are skeptical of Darwinian selection, and so therefore, evolution is false, or whatever they end up trying to
Yeah.
deliver.
So, Bernd,
Yeah, but
does
let
your
me,
perspective
yeah,
give you that same concern, or I'm just curious
yeah,
how you
but
see it.
let me talk about the same thing from a very different perspective. My colleague Susanna Kümel here in the Institute, you didn't meet her when you visit us here. She was not here in the Institute, but she does a very good work on the evolution of feet and legs in during the evolution of mammals. So she looks at mammals, the evolution of the mammalian evolution, and this goes mainly along what formerly has described as mammal-like reptiles. And there's a rich fossil record on mammal-like reptiles that starts in the Permian time, goes through all um, the um, well, it continues into the in English through all the Mesozoicum, throughout the Mesozoicum. So several million years, there are changes of the legs that you can find in the fossil record. And what does she find? She finds that step by step, organisms change their organization in reaction to functions. So she can in many details describe the changes of functions according to how these animals are living, whether they are running, climbing, or the environment in which they are living. And step by step, the morphology changes along functional principles. And then she comes to the conclusion that form follows function. So that's her central aspect. She can really show in many details in all her studies, form follows function. So it's quite clear that the organisms have an activity, or let's say an eigen-activity during their life, during their well, during their lifetimes. And this activity obviously changes the step by step during millions of years, the morphology, and changes to a more to a different form of movement the mammals have. Mammals have the legs beneath their bodies, while reptiles have them at the side. And so there is a big change of the way mammals move compared to reptiles. And in all these changes, the activity, the living, the surrounding, and the environment they are involved in plays a role. So that is, of course, in exchange with adaptation and possibly also with selection. But the main starting point always is an activity of the organism, a function to move in its environment. That's very clear, and you can show it in paleontological details. And so we really need, in understanding evolution, a notion that describes what's going on there, that this, let's say, eigenactivity is part of the evolutionary process. So this is not just a critique on former theories or of former ideas. I'm not so much concerned about the modern synthesis or theories, but we need a term to describe phenomena like this. And that's what I mean by phenomenology, to have terms, to have notions to describe such a phenomenon that we see in our research, comparing mammal-like reptiles. And this is what I mean with phenomenology, and to have a term to describe what we find in phenomenology. That's the point. So I'm not so much concerned about any critique on what the synthesis did or what other people think about selection, or that may be fine, but we need a term to describe the phenomena. And there, this activity of the organism, the organisms are involved in evolutionary changes. And especially in the changes, in the major transitions, there is some involvement of the activity of the organism. And you can show this very, very clear in the evolutionary transitions. And Susanna did this research since I think 2 decades now, and she has a lot of arguments to show how this activity is part of the process. And so we just need a term to describe what we are seeing. That's all.
Mhm.
That's not so much about theories or critical stance about something like, we just need a term to describe phenomena.
I'm perfectly happy with that. I was just trying to point out that the one of the greater contexts that is misrepresented by these poor faith actors is one in which, especially like what they call neo-Darwinism or the modern synthesis is being critiqued. It would be something like, so for instance, I work on levels of organization, and it would be like I wake up one day and there's an emerging literature claiming that levels of organization proves the existence of the great chain of being. I would lose the rest of my hair. And yeah, that's more of what I was getting at.
Yeah. Well, but I think you are right that we have to be very careful not to go in traps that have been open in former years, in the past. There are a lot of traps, we can step into them, but I think a lot major parts of biology doesn't care really about the phenomena we are seeing, the phenomena that evolution describes. If you look at major transitions, what really happens during the major transitions, there are more phenomena than really are described by terms. And we need terms, and I tried this for a long time with the term autonomy, and to describe what we can see in these phenomena, and avoiding all the traps you are mentioning. And so I think you are right, Dan, to talk about these possible connotations and traps and misunderstandings and all this. But what I'm really looking is how can we describe basic biological or evolutionary phenomena? And I really understand this as a very serious phenomenological approach.
Can you contrast? Because I think, I can tell, Bernd, with how you're saying things, to you, the phenomenological approach is just kind of dead obvious. At the same time, perhaps maybe there are a lot of people in biology who are approaching it differently. So what would you contrast a phenomenological approach with? Just to give people a sense of what you mean when you say a phenomenological approach.
Yeah, I fear that in many biological explanations, people start with some notions they have in mind that they have learned in their usual courses, in their training. And so there is a lot of thinking along mechanisms and molecular, well, basically molecular or genetic mechanisms. And that's not not a problem. It's not fault. But if you always are looking in the first place with every phenomenon, which molecular mechanism is behind a phenomenon, you don't
I see.
take the phenomenon itself serious. And my point is, you can talk about molecular mechanism, of course, and genetic background and all this is, but the first thing we have to do is to take the phenomena itself serious.
So it's almost like a Zen, it's almost like a Zen approach to dealing with what you see empirically, right? You don't come in already looking for, you don't come in with a preformed concept that you might have inherited from your thesis advisor,
that's a good
or
formulation.
a famous philosopher, and look for that.
And this,
okay.
and to describe this is not just a description. It can be an understanding. It can be an understanding in itself. And I think agency is a good term to show this, really to think about agency and what this phenomenon or this notion explains can be helpful to understand things. You don't have to expect something behind the thing of agency. There are a lot of things behind it. You have, of course, molecular principles, you have genetic principles, and you have metabolism and all these things. But to understand the phenomena itself and to have a notion for it that helps to understand the principle you are trying to explain. So the term agency is not just a description. It is a form of understanding what's really going on in the organism. And then in the second part, you start to find out how is the cell or an organism organizing itself to generate activity, self-activity. But the primary phenomenon is agency.
Dan, I'm just curious, how do you react to this sort of what Bernd is calling a phenomenological approach? As a philosopher for science, how do you, because I don't know if I perceive that happening much. Although I'm very empathetic to what Bernd is saying, and I think as a practicing scientist, I think that's kind of what we're doing. We don't have a word for that, and I think that's what's enabled us to go beyond molecular and genetic mechanisms. But I'm curious how that strikes you.
Well, phenomenology has a very rich history in philosophy, but it tends to mean, I think, something very different from what Bernd is talking about, because Bernd is taking the idea of the phenomenon, the thing that we're trying to um, investigate, the thing we're trying to interrogate, the thing we're trying to understand, the thing that maybe feeds back into the explanation of itself or something like that. And that's a very distinct entity from phenomenology in the tradition of someone like Edmund Husserl, for instance.
Yeah.
Um, I have to bracket that out the whole time
Sure,
to
sure.
not, but the so the take home message that I'm getting from Band is that the importance of thinking about things in terms of phenomena or this, phenomenological approach is that we need and students should be given more of an opportunity to slow down and think. Like,
Mhm.
what are we doing? What are we investigating? What are the sort of nuances that get passed up when we are rushed through the data and rushed through ways to produce more data and to publish as quickly as possible? If we had
Mhm.
time to sit down and think about this, then maybe we could have even not only directly produced, but also an appreciation for more nuanced versions of understanding. That's what I take Bam to be saying. Is that right?
Yeah, perfect, perfect. That's exactly what I mean. That's what we should do, uh, just as you formulated it. Perfect. Yeah. Hmm.
Is there a way that you see philosophy being helpful for that, Dan? Or the tools that come
Uh,
out of philosophy?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's general philosophy skills, and then there's more philosophy of science skills, and then maybe you get maybe further into the field specializations. Then you can add history into this. Then it gets really, then I find it gets really wild, because if you take a kind of sort of analytic approach to philosophy of science, like we kind of abstract away from history, we look at like these so-called timeless ways of thinking, evaluating argumentation and looking at what kinds of statements can hang together with other statements to provide or compel belief in a conclusion that we want to draw. There are a lot of ways to in a very practical sense, avoid um, well, I'll just be I'll just be straight about it. Avoid mistakes in reasoning that we can otherwise see in types of vaguenesses or um, conflations between otherwise distinct terms in biological texts when they try to be a bit more theoretical.
Mm.
Um, when you start adding history to that, so let's get out of this purely analytic frame, and we start thinking about, well, how is it like in actual practice, or how has this been historically attacked? So some phenomenon or a problem, how has this been historically attacked? Then what's interesting is that we can see um, sometimes we see impulses that have been articulated before, and sometimes these have also been articulated better than we are articulating them now. Uh,
Hmm.
Hmm.
and that just gives a lot more sophistication to our discussions when we have an ear to these types of issues, in my opinion.
Can I ask, because you use the word thinking, um,
Mhm.
almost like slowing down to think. How does the kind of texture or quality of thinking change when you think in this way versus kind of the very analytic way? If that's what you're distinguishing it with, like, that's what I'm trying to understand. How does the quality of thinking change,
The
and how
quality of thinking.
how the subject experiences it? Let's say the scientist or the thinker.
That's a really interesting question, and I want to hesitate for that because at that point the experience of science and the experience of inquiry becomes very individualized because the histories that we're going to be interested in, the questions that we're going to be interested in, theoretical or practical, are going to be, heavily skewed towards individual sort of development of our interests and stuff like that. But I think I could say that um, having time to think about these things and using that time to think about, these conceptual issues, historical issues, a combination of the both, feeds into three things that I think that you and I, Alan, talked about in Venice, about what makes a good researcher.
Hmm.
And the sort of framing that I proposed was that it was not technical knowledge, because everyone needs technical knowledge to get into the door to be a scientist at all. But you can also be a poor researcher and possess technical knowledge. The three things that I propose that we need are patience, discipline, and intellectual curiosity. And when we have more time to think about these things, these are precisely the types of characteristics that I think really become cultivated. So the way that knowledge changes is that we're aware that we're, for instance, repeating ourselves in a tradition that we find fascinating or useful for attacking a certain issue or problem, for instance. We're aware of the predecessors who have said it in ways that it have inspired us, and we're going to build on that and usually that's much better than just trying to build to invent the wheel from scratch.
Mhm. Isn't it even the case that scientists are not at all used to reflect their own thinking? They are not just not used to think about their own concepts and forms of explanation, or even what an explanation is, or what is accepted as an explanation. Often something is accepted as an explanation that everybody just mentions or says. And so if you have a special term or a special wording, uh, it can be accepted as an explanation if you use it. So that's a bit hard to say it, but what I think, what I experience even with medical students, for example, here in the university, they are not used to reflect how they think, how they come to their notions about and their to their explanations. What really they accept as explanation. It's there's no culture to reflect the own thinking.
Mm.
Yeah, there are two things that jump into mind for me. One is that is, I think I might have mentioned earlier, I can't remember at this point, a practical upshot of a training in philosophy is pretty much heavily skewed towards the ability to scrutinize and question what you think that you know. Right. I mean, this is what Socrates was all about, interrogating what's the famous quote? The unexamined life is not worth living, so to speak. The second point was, so whether or not scientists do this, I'm not sure, but an anecdote came to mind where in philosophy, trying to examine what a scientific explanation is a gigantic issue. It's a gigantic
Yeah,
topic that many people have been talking about for decades now.
yeah.
And one thing, for my 2 cents on the explanation literature, is that um, whereas philosophers tend to come up with sort of idealized versions of what a completed explanation should look like, uh, I think it's relatively rare that we have completed explanations. We have
Mhm.
increasingly better explanations, but then something will change, our interest will change. We'll move away from looking at that phenomenon in terms of another phenomenon, for instance. And these ultimately complete explanations are relatively rare, in my opinion.
Mhm. Yeah.
And for this reason, this kind of pushes the need to interrogate and question what we think.
Mhm. Yeah, but my point is not so much to formalize or to think about what we can accept as an explanation, but just about thinking how we think. So knowing
Well,
which perspective do I take? And for example, isn't it even important for a scientist, or would it be important for a scientist to learn that every explanation has just one perspective? And usually things in biology are very complex and you need different perspectives on a thing. But what we see all the time is that one perspective is the most important and is the dominant perspective, and everything else is not allowed to think. But if you take these different perspectives together, you have a better approach to what really is going on. For example, if you take more a reductionistic perspective or a holistic perspective or a system perspective, they may be appropriate altogether at the same time, but you need these different perspectives. But people tend to exclude perspectives that they themselves don't use. Let's take a picture of a tree. If you see if you see a tree from just one perspective, from one side, you don't have a complete picture of the tree. So you have to go around the tree and see it from the other side and from different sides to really have an image of the whole tree. And you will see that the tree has different shapes, different forms from every perspective. And I think we really need especially in biology, in things that are so complex in biology, different perspectives, and that we should be able to accept different perspectives at the same time.
mhm.
Different as you can, for example, a cell, you can take the perspective of the molecular processes, you can the perspective of the morphology of the whole cell, you can take the perspective of how a cell is integrated into an epithelium. And so, but only if you have all these different perspectives, and they can be holistic, they can be reductionistic, they can the systems process, or you can look at as networks, but only if you have an open mind to accept different perspectives, you can come in a phenomenological way nearer to what is really happening in the organism.
Absolutely. I mean, the metaphor that kind of jumps out is the three blind people and the elephant,
Yeah.
who
Okay.
have these
Right.
different
Yeah.
different
Yeah. Yeah.
perspectives
Yeah. Yeah.
that they refuse to integrate, so to speak. But also, oh, I'm losing the thought because I got caught on that. No, I'll push it back to you.
No,
I
I think
lost my
that's
thought.
maybe so. I think this so far this discussion has really come out of this kind of notion of agency and kind of all of the sort of things it touches upon. I think there's another word I'd like to bring up, which I think is also something that's controversial. And I think if you're an experimentalist and you're just like wading out into the world of philosophy, it's hard to kind of get a sense of the different kind of factions and how people approach this word. And I think it's the word which relates to reductionism, which is holism.
Mhm.
And that term holism. And Dan, I know you've been very interested in this notion, I think, of what you call obstructive holism, which you feel like
Yes.
doesn't move things forward. I think you would admit that. I don't know. Would you think that? Would you agree with the claim that a lot of modern biology is excessively reductionist?
Uh, I'll just say yes. I think
Okay,
it's
like very
excessively reductionist.
very broadly speaking, and but at the same time, you say, well, we have to be careful about holism and especially obstructive holism. So anyway, I know Dan, you had written about that, but maybe you could explain kind of that yes, there's a need to move beyond sort of extreme reductionism. At the same time, you notice this issue of obstructive holism. Maybe you could kind of open with that, and then I'd be interested to see what Bernd's take is on that.
Okay, that's interesting because I mean, holism and reductionism are sort of, Janus face. It's a Janus face sort of discussion, um, where on the one hand, what I'm what I'm trying to filter out by saying reductionism or obstructive extreme reductionism or obstructive holism is the extremes. So extreme positions may be good for individuals to make a career or to make a statement or to carve out the discussion space of a topic or something like that. But it's rarely good for a whole community to take on such a radical position because we need, as Bernd was saying, a diversity of perspectives. And so this idea of obstructive holism is just supposed to be the counterpart to extreme reductionism. That's not to say, however, that reductive approaches are not good and, in fact, have been the most successful approaches to studying phenomena in biology since the beginning of inquiry among human beings. Um, but at the same time, we can also take a holistic kind of perspective that does not extrapolate to. That's the problem with reductive, and we have reductionism and reductive. So we have this kind of like escalation of going from reductive to reductionism. But holism, it's kind of the same word. So what I mean by obstructive holism comes from the tradition of the organicists, and specifically the thought stream of some of the organicists, definitely not all, but some of the organicists, to sort of entrench or codify this thinking of holism as the only possible solution to what they perceived as the threat of mechanistic reductionism at the beginning of the 20th century. And so you have people like John Scott Haldane, who said that as soon as we start to partition the organism in any way, then we have annihilated. I think that's precisely the word he used. We have annihilated the phenomenon, so to speak, that we're trying to understand. And so obstructive holism is for me a contrastive notion to just more basically a more open-minded type of holism, where it's not just following the credo, don't look down, as the extreme reductionist would say, don't look up, but rather it's let's look here and relatively upwards, while at the same time being open and tolerant, as once again Ban said, to maybe more meso or micro perspectives.
Mhm. Yeah, I would agree to all this, but let me try to do the same thing with a different term. I would prefer. I myself don't use much the term holism, and I don't like it because these one-sided forms. I don't use holism so much. Um, I think there are alternatives to describe the principle that is focused at in a more neutral way. And you can, for example, use the term system. Now, this opens up a new discussion and new misunderstandings and everything like this. But if you can define a system as in the sense of of an of an integrative system, a system that integrates certain principles below it, for example, within the cell, but that is open to other influences. You don't have the problem to deal with closed holes or some radical understanding of holism. And if you use the term system and describe what really is involved when a system integrates functions, integrates principles or things that are part of the whole system, you can come out of this one-sidedness of holism. And therefore, I I very much appreciate the approach of Paul Weiss. I know that Alan knows this very well. he was one person who very, very carefully defined what he really understands by a system, and that a system has a certain stability, that has functions of integrating parts, but at the same time being open to um, to other levels. And so he avoids um, to define something like a whole organism. And every organism has a certain openness and a certain closeness at the same time. And there, I think we have a really an example how to define a system. I would say an integrative system very carefully and very um, strong along the phenomena, and to get it useful to understand what really is going on in an organism, in a cell, in a tissue, and things like this. And in this sense, I think what Weiss did was very much phenomenological, because he was a very experienced experimenter. He did a lot of laboratory work on tissues and on embryology, and he really tried to come to a definition of an integrative system that is very, very near to what he saw in the lab. And I think this is very, very impressive. And again, for this, I don't need all what has been understood as a system. There's a rich literature, and as a philosopher, you know this all, Dan, I think, much more than I do. But I don't need all these um, this discussion. I only need a term to describe what really is going on with such a cell or with a tissue or with an organism. And Weiss did this. He was very, very close to what really is going on. And there is a certain form of closeness. There is an integration. There is an organization that the integrative system is doing. But at the same time, and that's curious, I would call it concurrency. At the same time, concurrently, the cell has some openness, has exchange, has a sensitivity, and all these things. So this system, this integrative system of a cell, has at the same time some openness and some closeness. And this is the biological phenomenon. And to describe this with an appropriate term, or with several appropriate terms, to understand what really an organism is doing, that's more interesting than going into all these curious definitions of system or things like this, or holism. I fear that holism looks too much at or sounds like something closed up, that is closed up. No organism is really closed up, but a system has an openness, has a closeness, and all these things, and that's what I'm looking for. But I
Okay.
think that's basically the same what you said, but you formulated it from the philosophical viewpoint. But it's basically the same. It doesn't contradict it.
Yeah, there's definitely overlap, I think, in our sort of prescriptions for how to capture these interesting biological phenomena. The thing with system is that you gave a good characterization of the term, and you especially endeared yourself to me by citing Weiss as being the one of the authors of this notion of a system. But as soon as we get into a large community, that's the problem of the multiplicity of the meanings that we attribute to a system is just going
Yeah,
to explode.
yeah, of
So,
course. Yeah,
right. Yeah. Um,
I think for me, the way around that again is to always have the terms you're using be very glued almost to particular empirical observations, right? So if you're always grounded in the a particular phenomenon. Let's say for us right now, we're thinking really hard about how a field of limb progenitors bifurcates into cartilage and soft tissue fields, right? That could maybe help. There might be something in every individual human that allows them to understand what you mean when you use the word system, when it's contextualized within a particular empirical context, rather than, to me, what seems like an impossible task, which is just sort of abstractly arguing for some definition of a system that will just hold independent of some particular context. Which
Exactly.
Sometimes I feel is what philosophers do, and which then I think turns off scientists sometimes, because then you just end up with these articles and articles and articles of people fighting over different kind of schemas, basically.
And yeah, exactly. Just wrestling over like the minutia of what a possible term could mean or did mean, you know. Yeah, no,
I don't know. I don't
exactly.
know if you buy that or not. I mean, because like I think there's also, I mean, this is something I wanted to ask you, Dan, but in a delicate way, which is, what's your take on why so many scientists are either think philosophy is irrelevant or are even like hostile towards it?
Well, for one thing, I
Is there
think
anything that the field of philosophy, is there any soul searching that the field itself could do in terms of offering an olive branch?
well, for one thing, I would say that philosophy is a much more diverse field than something like biology, at least in the sense that most of philosophy, I would venture to say, is not interested in interacting with science at all. Right. I mean, you have things like ethics and morality and political philosophy and um, um, entire traditions of analysis that are just simply not interested in interacting with philosophers. And yet, there is this sort of core analysis of looking at common questions that scientists and philosophers used to have when philosophy and science used to be the same thing. These systems of the world that Plato came up with, that Aristotle came up with, that, the impact of Descartes was very much philosophical as also astronomical, mathematical, and physical and medical, right? And a lot of philosophers are still looking at the promises of these systems, for instance, about the nature of the world, about how we produce knowledge, about the nature of the good and stuff like that, that simply don't really have any kind of interface with contemporary biology, for instance. So Descartes, everyone in philosophy knows Descartes for the I think therefore I am statement, and a little bit deeper you're going to recognize him with through his from his debates with William Harvey about what the mechanism of the of circulation was in with the heart. But I mean, you ask a biologist, you're going to be lucky if they've heard of him and his contributions to medicine, for instance. And so there is this kind of difference there. But with the corners of philosophy that are interested in interacting with scientists, there is this sort of like once again this umbrella term that imports bad impressions that maybe scientists have had, and that is philosophy, right? But it does make a difference if you're a philosopher of science, for instance, or if you're a phenomenologist, or if you're a ethicist, for instance. I mean, you're just simply doing very different things.
I see.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But may I ask a question to Alan? What do you think? Why the approach of Weiss has not been so successful in science? He was a very well-known empirical scientist of his time. He was very prominent in the American system of science, and he again and again tried to propose his notion of an integrative system, but he was forgotten. He was completely forgotten, has been completely forgotten. There
I
are rarely some citations of Weiss. Nobody knows about him. Why was he not successful with this approach?
this is a question for me. I think this would be a great I think thesis for for a philosopher of history or science who actually wants to help science, because I think there's a lot of work that needs to be like probably you'd probably have to talk to people. You'd have to really, I don't think it's something that you could figure out with just a Google search.
No.
Interestingly, I'm at the university that he was at. I'm at Rockefeller University, right?
Yeah,
So he was
richtig.
he was at,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and I promise you, not a single faculty member probably knows who he is.
Yeah,
Even though he coined some very important terms, like I
yeah.
think he coined. I mean, I'm forgetting now. I used to know these off the top of my head, but terms that are used in neuroscience and neurology, or I think he was. One thing that I've noticed, because I've tried to get people in my lab to read his work and sort of work with him, is when you read his, I'm of the view that someone's writing style is almost like a reflection of their inner consciousness. What you can't, it's almost like the extant manifestation of what you can't see in their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read his writing, it just really feels like he comes from a different time in terms of how people used to think. The only way I can say it now is like when you read scientific writing today, it's so mechanical. It's like Lego block thinking. It doesn't have curvature and flow to it. It's the only way I can say it, right? Like there's just almost like a poetry and
flow.
I don't know, a flow to just the way his thinking works, Paul Weiss, that I think kind of got excised as the molecular biology revolution took over with people like Monod and Watson and Crick. I as great as their accomplishments were, I think, and I'll say this publicly, I don't think those people were anywhere at the level of thinking as someone like Paul Weiss. Even though they discovered important facts about what happens in the cell. And I think he was trained, I believe he was from Vienna. I think he was I think raised in a culture and a way of thinking that was just much more broad, than sort of how people are trained today. We had a discussion with Eric Peterson, who wrote the book The Life Organic, and one of the things that he brought up from his historical research, and he would probably be someone who would have a better answer than I would. But he said that Conrad Waddington, one of the things that he was most troubled by at the end of his career was not necessarily that his specific ideas of epigenetics and things like that weren't being taken. It was that the way in which scientists were being trained was getting to be far, far more sort of technical. And so that's, we now live 2-3 generations in from this cleavage in sort of how scientists are groomed to relate to the living world, that makes it difficult for them to even open themselves up to Weiss's work. It's sort of like how, if maybe if a 14-year-old has grown up on TikTok, it might be hard for them to open themselves up to Shakespeare. Shakespeare just seems like he's just living in a different world, even though Shakespeare has very important things to express about the human condition. There's a barrier, I would say, in consciousness. I don't know if that's too imprecise of it. This is just my feeling. I had to discover Paul Weiss on my own. I remember I went through I went through this radical. I remember when we started our lab at Rockefeller, I discovered Paul Weiss, and I said, well, why have I not been? Why was I not taught this? Like, in a way, we rediscovered what Paul Weiss was doing, and our lab was really about that. I think if there's any lineage we're continuing out of, it's the lineage of Paul Weiss. But I only discovered him after we had initiated our own program. So but I would say the most telling thing is I noticed we actually we taught a course called Systems Biology, which was really a front for teaching organicism. And we just read out loud. We read out loud pieces, and we read out loud Paul Weiss, and I could tell that the students were just uncomfortable with the way he expressed his
Ah,
ideas.
phew.
Um, and
Because
so
he's so clear in his thoughts. It's so
he is
so
clear.
logical. So
It is,
you
but it
can
has.
understand sentence by sentence. There is no
Go ahead, Dan.
curious things or mystical things. Yeah,
Yeah,
nothing mystical about it. Nothing strange. Or he's very, very clearly putting things together point by point, and so you can really follow his thoughts. And I always thought, why don't people understand that?
it's a good.
It's
Yeah.
so
No,
clear.
I agree with you, but I think there's almost an organic. There's a sort of an organic feel to how he
Mhm.
expresses himself. Um, I think it's also much more conceptually laden.
Mhm.
Uh, I, than how we're expected to express ourselves in science today. I think now it's sort of, when you write our scientific paper, I think the expectation is it should just be data, 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 and
Mhm.
at the very end, you can quote unquote present an interpretation,
Mhm.
which then maybe
But
there's space there, but
yeah, do you think that could be a problem with my book, with the properties of life? Because that's somehow the same way I tried to describe logically which phenomena we see and to interpret this. And I tried to integrate a lot of examples and phenomena um, to argue for them. But in the end, it's a more conceptual text. And do you think that might be a comparable problem with the text, with this book? Or what do you think?
um, well, I wouldn't call it a problem, but that may be a barrier,
Mhm.
right? But that doesn't, I mean, and this is where uh, we're making choices too into how we run our lab and how we do things, because just because something is a barrier doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done,
Yeah.
right? But I think this is why this all goes to me about education,
Mhm.
um, and uh, and and I think we have to. You can't wait until people. Dan, just to fill you in, Bernd was just asking, whether he was just asking me whether I think there could be a similar problem with his writing in his book, because he kind of, I think, sees himself as sort of presenting his ideas in the style. I certainly think it is. I think what has happened, it's this interesting polarity where biology is at once both hyper empirical and also hyper abstract.
Mhm.
It's this weird thing where there's an extreme dislocation between the realm of ideas and thoughts and concepts and the realm of like what you observe. And that's why I think your this kind of, I think the true middle path is this sort of return to phenomenology and kind of openness, and then layering in just the minimal set of ideas you might need
Mhm.
to make sense of what you're experiencing. I think that's the only way out of this.
Mhm.
Um, because otherwise what you have is people kind of arguing about ideas and then people just sort of generating data. And so I
Mhm.
think data generation and the what you use to kind of make sense of that, I think, has become very, very split. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I don't have a good, my hope is that something like the conceptual biology forum is just meant to just shed light on that, on
Mhm.
that, on
Mhm.
that,
Yeah.
on that issue. But I don't want to, I want to give you guys I apologize if I'm speaking too much about my own views, but
Oh no,
that's sort of how I
that's
see
good.
it. Can I,
Um,
so, but maybe relating to that, I think this could be a good place to close. You both have been very generous with your time. Uh, when we think about, you mentioned Paul Weiss, and I think if you look at Paul Weiss and some of these other early organicists who are, I think, thinking about a lot of the concepts we've been talking about today, and I think have largely been removed from mainstream curricula in high
mhm.
school and in the university, a lot of them really were inspired by Goethe
Mhm.
and this figure who's mostly known for his contributions to literature, and he was also a very important statesman. Um, but the original organicists were very inspired by him. And I'm curious for both of you, do you see him as being a relevant figure today in like sort of a cutting edge way, or is he mostly just relevant as someone who inspired the generation of people like Paul Weiss, who now we sort of admire and respect? I'm just curious where you land on that.
Yeah, I
That's a
think,
really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Because
yeah,
I will
I
say,
think,
like,
yeah,
just as an example, when I went to this global meeting of philosophers, historians, his name was not brought up once, but there was a lot of discussion of people who were inspired who were inspired by him. So I'm just curious,
yeah, yeah.
you know.
I think he really is a central figure because basically he tried a phenomenological approach um, that really tried to get near to the phenomena and to take the interpretations out of these phenomena. Of course, this was a different time, and this was a first approach, and it's very focused on some plants. That was his main concern, and then with colors he looked at. But he always was trying to come near to an interpretation that comes out of the phenomena. So he's really an impressive figure of phenomenology. There's a lot of history between this, but the basic feeling that we need such a phenomenology, that was really inspired by Goethe. And so he's really a father, one father, um, be, um, beside other ones, of such an approach that really doesn't try um, to get lost in analysis. And therefore, I think Goethe is a central figure of all these approaches. And of course, basically, the organism, an organismic view, is in this mind, is in this tradition somehow. And he even, and that was really amazing, he didn't go into these traps of a one-sided holism nor a one-sided reductionism. He had a very um, um, a sense, a good sense about avoiding these one-sidedness, the one-sidedness of holism and reductionism. And then it has to be a development. How can we go between these extremes? How can we go with real phenomena? And it's really amazing that Goethe avoided these extremes. So he's a very um, he's a basic figure of this form of thinking, I think.
So you think he should be explicitly referred to in curricula in the way that Mendel and Newton and
Yeah,
other great
but
figures are?
describing, very exactly describing what he did, what he tried, and in a modern form, not just repeating what Goethe said or what Goethe did, trying to understand his attitude,
Mm,
his base. Yeah, that's the point. Understanding his attitude between these extremes and trying to be very careful along the biological phenomena. That and
yeah.
and if it is if a course or a training tries to understand his form of thinking, not the old interpretations and his kind of his it's great how he expressed it, and his wordings is great, but that's not what science today needs. It needs his stance, his attitude to these phenomena, to look at the organism. And we would need to do this in a much more modernized form. And then we can learn a lot of Goethe.
How about you, Dan?
I've just recently discovered Goethe's scientific work. Well, not discovered it, but engaged with it in some depth. And I think what I take from him is a a breathtaking sophistication of conceptual thinking applied to extremely careful empirical work.
Mhm.
In terms of his relevance to curricula today, I think that there is probably several more steps of removal than someone like even Paul Weiss, because Paul Weiss at least was, well, I mean, he was just closer to us in time. And so with Goethe, you have to look at English translations probably. And there's going to be multiple translations, some of which are scientifically literate, some of which are not, for instance. Um, I mean, I think he absolutely should be resurrected as a historical figure, but in the proper context.
Mhm.
Because I mean, to get really into Goethe, in my opinion, you have to already have an appreciation for and a grasp on conceptual reasoning.
Mhm.
Um, because it's it's a slog for someone who is used to these types of technical writing from nowadays.
Mhm.
um if you have a trained sensibility to enjoy the poetic part of science that is to a large extent missing nowadays, then that would probably accelerate your engagement with him. um but I think that we're even losing the sort of context in which Goethe could be resurrected, even though I think he should be,
Mhm.
into our curricula.
Mhm.
Mm, yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. That's I think for me as a practicing sort of someone who's, operating and directing a lab, I think what he means to me is sort of it was like his disposition in a sense. It's not necessarily, maybe like what Bernd is saying. It's not the products of his work, but
Mhm.
really how he oriented himself
Mhm.
in between, in a sense, the realm of what you observe empirically and, in a sense, the realm of ideas out
Mhm.
of which
Hmm.
concepts come. There's there's this balance point that the human, the subject, the actual science, capital S scientist occupies, where where it's the scientist that brings these two realms together in this very, I can't use another word except to say poetic, when I just mean that it's a delicate process that requires a lot
Hmm.
of intuitive judgment. Um, that to me, I think is how I see it. It to me it feels very different than like
Mhm.
the Cartesian disposition, let's say, or
Absolutely.
even the Newton, or like how Newton is presented today. I think he was much more complex than how he's represented today,
Mhm.
but at least how he's represented today. Um, but I think even having that, I'm still working on how to phrase that, what I just said,
Mhm.
to young people who are being in the cult of STEM as it's represented. STEM is, I don't know if you
Mhm.
know that term, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So
Mhm.
yeah.
I mean, I just have to put a point on Goethe's work, especially his work on biological organization is exceptionally prescient.
Mm,
Mhm.
It's very, very good stuff.
yeah.
But I mean, who thinks about that anymore? Who thinks about organization anymore, right? I mean, there are people who do that, but then there's so much that's happened since then that Goethe kind of gets like not maybe forgotten or squeezed out, but they just terminate the historical depth until before they get to, his time when he was writing about it.
Yeah. 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 No, that's fair. Well, I think this is really great. I thank you so much for being so generous and open in kind of sharing your views. And I think also, I think, yeah, I think what became clear to me is that you both have different, and not necessarily bad or good, but just different, slightly different dispositions for how you're kind of approaching these questions. And I think, to me at least, that became clearer. And I think it'll be helpful for people to see. Is there maybe like as a final closing, for each of you, if there's sort of one thing you would urge or beseech young people to maybe consider that they may not consider based on kind of your own particular experience and expertise, is there anything you want to just leave people with?
Mhm.
I'll
Yeah,
go full. Oh,
let's try to do it in one sentence.
Yeah.
I propose to think about your own thinking. Think how you are thinking. People are not used um, to look or to have a consciousness about how you come to notions and explanations and how you think. That's a central point, I guess.
I would go full romantic and say keep a diary of scientific poetry. Whenever you see a passage by Paul Weiss or by Goethe or something
Yeah,
that inspires you, put them together and start reflecting on that,
yeah.
and start thinking about, uh, what is sort of dawning on you instead of what you don't, in light of what you don't get in reading this technical writing,
Hmm.
Mhm,
That's
because
wonderful.
yeah, it'll lead you down some unexpected paths.
mhm.
Well, that's great. Great. Well, again, thank you both again. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Yeah,
you
thank
for
you. Thank you for
organizing
having us.
this